When a universe bruises, it does not do so quietly. It cracks with the sound of old scores being read aloud, an animal, incandescent and hungry, the exact shape of a grievance that never got the courtesy of an answer. Mangog was that sound made manifest, the compounded, concentrated hatred of billions upon billions of lives erased and thwarted, the echo of grief and outrage given teeth and motion. He was not born from blood alone, but from the moral arithmetic that lives refuse to forgive. In the long runes of Asgardian memory, he was called the vengeance of a lost people. In the leafless alleys of small planets, he was the consequence of a god who thought himself beyond account. Wherever pity calcified into fury, Mangog found fuel. Saitama was a different kind of cosmic event. He was banal in description until you tried to explain what banal did when the world's ceiling collapsed on it. An ordinary man in an ordinary cape who had, by discipline and absurdity, closed the gap between aimless strength and absolute efficacy. He did not live to embody a philosophical point. He existed because a gag ran long enough to become a truth. He ate grocery store bargains. He punched meteorites. He bore the patient ennui of someone who had never been surprised by his own power. The world around him made heroes into statues and him into a nuisance, both simple and terrifying. The fracture that would bring them together began as a whisper across realities, an echo of something that could not be contained to one ledger of physics. Mangog, having been once bound in a tomb of memory, was stirring because hatred is not a thing that dies when its body is shattered. It disperses like salt across an ocean and becomes an undercurrent. In pockets of other worlds, in the narrow channels where imagination bleeds into possibility, the chorus of the wronged hummed and converged. The multiverse does not always separate grief from consequence. When the scale tips, it knits them together. Saitama felt it as a disruption in the boredom. There are many ways for a man like him to become interested. An earthquake that spat out a new monster, a challenge that lasted longer than a minute, a villain who sneered at groceries. He did not care for mythic origins, but practical curiosity is a hook that catches on everything. He followed fissures in the sky like paper trails, not because he believed in prophecy, but because the noise promised interruption. By the time he crossed the threshold between worlds, he had already decided, in that unhurried, indifferent way of his, that any opponent worth the trouble would at least make him stand up. They arrived as two different inevitabilities. Mangog did not approach like a conquering king. He moved like the emphasis in an accusation, like the moment in a long argument when someone slams the table and everything in the room rearranges itself around a single moral demand, to be acknowledged, to be made wrong. He collected anger. He painted desolation with the hand of a jury that would never be persuaded. Around him cities folded like paper, not because physics demanded it, but because collective hurt had become a language of force. Saitama arrived like an answer no one had asked for. He stepped into the shadow of Mangog with an almost apologetic loaf of bread under his arm, a gesture of ridiculous normalcy. The sight was comical, the infinite rage of a cosmos against the indifferent calm of a man who could end anything with an indifferent swing. It should have been simple. It was not. For even a punch that could erase mountains could not touch the thing Mangog truly was, a predicate, a persistent relation among minds. You could grind the manifestation into glitter, but the cause, the unresolved injustice, the remembered pain remained. People watched from the edges of existence. The watchers were a mixed lot, gods with the taste of ancient wine in their mouths, philosophers who had become gods out of boredom, ghosts who had learned to read the grammar of ire. They argued in low voices. Some saw in Mangog the necessary reckoning of tyrants. Others saw in him an engine of annihilation. Some, in private, asked if annihilation could ever be a true remedy. What would it mean to slake an ocean of sorrow with the dryness of absolute destruction? The question itself was a tiny argument, a hinge on which the battle would swing. Saitama, who despised preambles, listened without really listening. He was honest in his indifference. If Mangog could provide a fight that lasted longer than 5 minutes, he might stop wondering what lay behind his own flatness. Mangog, on the other hand, did not carry questions, he carried verdicts. He spoke in a voice that made the air around him rearrange into the syllables of accusation. "You took from us," he said, not to Saitama alone, but to all who had ever closed their eyes on a crime. Words like that are weapons when they are true. They demand reply. This is where philosophy crept, uninvited and precise, into what the universe intended to be simple violence. If power is the ability to effect change, then whose change counts as reality? If strength is measured by the capacity to destroy, can annihilation be measured against the persistence of what was destroyed? The Watchers circled the problem like surgeons, scalpels flashing. Saitama represented force as solution, instantaneous, unadorned, a logic that likes tidy ends. Mangog represented force as commentary, violence as symptom and proclamation. Do not pretend you can beat an idea into death. The stage was set not across a battlefield alone, but on the brittle trust between consequence and remedy. If Mangog's manifestation was a cosmic ledger that listed crimes and refused to forgive, Saitama was the blunt instrument that had never had to answer the question of why those crimes happened at all. Their meeting then would not be a matter of muscles but of metaphysics. One man with a punch had always been able to end any physical thing. The other thing, however, lived in stories, in grievances, in the closed eyes of the bereaved. The first chapter of this conflict closed on that thin, terrible ledger, that some fights are not about who can hit the hardest, but about who can change the reason people keep getting hurt. The first blow landed like a false promise. Saitama swung and the air split, a cleanness to the strike that had ended oceans before. Mangog's skin, if one could call the manifest hatred skin, cracked, carved into screaming geometry, and then collapsed into dust that glittered with a darkness that was not absence but memory. For a breath, every watcher smiled or held their breath. The narrative had favored Saitama before. Destroy the thing and the threat is over. For a breath, it looked done. Then the dust gathered. It was not wind or physics. It was attention. From the distant cities and ruined planets, the faint hum of remembered offense rose like a choir, and where thought attends, being follows. Mangog reassembled, not as the same sculpture of malice, but as an accretion more patient and precise, a thing built from resentments that had learned to hide in ordinary hearts. Saitama punched again. The world quivered, and the second blow sent a crater where an idea had been. For a moment he considered that repetition, like everything else, might be enough. Mangog's reply was not purely a counterstrike. It was an argument translated into force. You think annihilation solves, he said, his voice a continent of accusation. You pulverize, and you believe the ledger is cleared. But laws are written on living skin. To ink them out with a fist is to ignore the hand that wrote them. The Watchers heard the lesson and understood the stroke. Hatred is not a statue that stands until it is toppled. It is a social grammar. You cannot abolish it by removing its most visible predicate. Philosophy in the heat of battle is not an interruption. It is the battlefield. Saitama had been a parable of fait accompli. If something exists and you can hit it, then hitting is the moral motion. Mangog embodied counter-parable. If something arises from relations, oppression, contempt, betrayal, then the proper question is not whether you can break the creature, but whether you can break the relation. The debate became manifest as strategy. Mangog's power drew on that fact. He fed off active hatred. Every shout that blamed, every silence that excused, every grudge that simmered into ordinary action poured back into him. Saitama's blows cleared space. The world's grievances rushed into that space and made new Mangogs like water filling hollows. Saitama, in that rare moment when he was not bored, thought quickly and honestly. He understood force. He understood that a punch that solved an algebra of fists might still be impotent against an algebra of suffering. He tried to use the one thing he had that no one else did, an example of invulnerability that suggested security rather than terror. He stood between the people and Mangog and punched not to erase but to protect. He moved mountains and drove shockwaves that calmed fissures. For a while it worked. Citizens stopped turning their grief into rage because they had a human, unbreakable proof that not every problem answered with force. For a while the ledger thinned, but Mangog's ontology adapted. If suffering wants recognition and the world's compact refuses to give honest redress, then the vacuum Saitama created became a magnet for the unsaid. The survivors' private hatreds congealed. Neighbors who had previously leaned toward forgiveness found themselves giving in to the old, simple logic, hurt must be avenged. Mangog did not merely reconstitute, he instrumentalized moral failure. He showed how systemic injustices breed vengeful forms and how a universe that relies on brute force to answer brute force never ends the cycle. The Watchers, those who had wanted a clean contest of might, realized that Mangog's strategy was not to win a duel but to win the world. He sought not to kill Saitama, but to convert the world into enough rage that destruction was not an endpoint, but an ongoing process. Saitama's power, brilliant and absolute in physical register, had no tool for addressing structural grievance. He could show that strength exists without malice. He could not make men apologize or invent the governmental systems that might prevent the wrongs that created Mangog. In the end, victory did not come as an ironic coup de grace, but as a philosophical exhaustion. Saitama landed his final honest blow and felt something like satisfaction. Pavements shattered, winds bent. For a breath everyone believed. Then the living remembered why they had begun to hate, loss that saw no recompense, histories that became rhetorical footnotes, lives whose erasures were trivialized. Their hearts' small, stubborn furnaces rekindled the beast. Mangog rose, larger because he had learned to feed on the very efforts to extinguish him. The moral calculus had shifted. Brute force had been proven insufficient. Structural change had not been achieved. Saitama fell because the world did not stop fueling Mangog. Not because his fist was weak, but because the thing his fist fought was not only matter. Mangog won because he was the perpetuation of a social wound that the battle did not close. He stood there, now less a monster and more a mirror, and the watchers had no heroic line to write. The lesson was ugly and direct. Annihilation without transformation is a bandage, not a cure. When the dust settled, Mangog did not laugh. He did not need to. He was victory made inevitable by the refusal of systems to heal. He was the proof that some problems are conceptual and survive physical solutions. Saitama, bruised and unbroken in body but diminished in certainty, looked at the resurgence and understood something he had never properly had to know, that might without wisdom can clear a battlefield but cannot rewrite the ledger of being. The world would continue, carrying on with its daily injustices, and whenever it did, Mangog would find the fragments to build himself again. That is why Mangog was the winner, not because he was stronger in the shallow contest of blows, but because his victory exposed a deeper arithmetic. Hatred, if unaddressed, is self-perpetuating. Annihilation begets new grievances, and force alone cannot convert moral wounds into healing. Saitama could overturn the physical world. He could not, with a punch, make a society repent. In the clash between physical omnipotence and metaphysical persistence, persistence born of unresolved injury proved the truer power. The fight closed with the world still whole in shape, but altered in its terms. Brute force had run out of answers, and the ledger continued to be written by those who had not yet been heard. Mangog had won the contest that mattered.